August 17, 1965, Chu Lai, Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. A South Vietnamese informant walks into the Marine base with information that changes everything. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment, approximately 2,000 soldiers, is preparing to attack the base at Chu Lai. Not a probe, not a harassing attack, a full assault, designed to overrun the base and kill every Marine inside. The attack is planned for tonight. General Louis Walt, commanding general of the 3 Marine Amphibious Force, receives the intelligence report. He makes a decision. The Marines will not wait. They will attack first. What is planned in the next 16 hours and executed over the following 6 days becomes the first major American offensive ground operation of the entire Vietnam War. Operation Starlite, the battle that told the Marine Corps and the Viet Cong what this war was going to look like. To understand Operation Starlite, you need to understand where the Vietnam War stood in August 1965. American combat troops had been arriving in Vietnam since March 1965, when the 1st Marine Battalion landing teams came ashore at Da Nang. But American forces had been operating largely in a defensive posture, protecting air bases, conducting local security operations, patrolling their immediate areas. Washington was still debating how aggressively American forces should be employed. There were voices in the administration that argued for restraint, for allowing South Vietnamese forces to carry the offensive burden, while Americans provided support. General Walt was not interested in restraint. Walt was a decorated World War II and Korean War veteran who had been given command of Marine forces in I's Corps, the 5 northernmost provinces of South Vietnam. He understood that sitting behind defensive perimeters and waiting for the enemy to attack on his own terms was not a winning strategy. The intelligence from the South Vietnamese informant gave him an opportunity to prove it. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment, known as the R-20 Doc Lap Battalion and associated units, had established itself on the Batangan Peninsula, approximately 12 miles south of Chu Lai. The peninsula was a distinctive piece of terrain, a thumb of land jutting into the South China Sea, surrounded on 3 sides by water, with the neck of the peninsula connecting it to the mainland. If Marine forces could seal the neck of the peninsula and simultaneously land on the beaches, the Viet Cong regiment would be trapped. It was exactly the kind of combined arms encirclement operation that the Marine Corps had been trained for. Walt ordered his staff to plan the operation immediately. They had 16 hours. What was produced in those 16 hours was a multi-pronged attack that would use every asset available to the Marine force: ground infantry, amphibious assault, helicopter-borne forces, naval gunfire from ships offshore, and close air support from marine aviation. The concept was straightforward. 1 Marine battalion would conduct an amphibious landing directly on the beaches of the Batangan Peninsula, coming from the sea as Marines had trained for in exercises going back decades. A 2nd Marine force would be inserted by helicopter to block the escape routes from the landward side of the peninsula. A 3rd force would push south from Chu Lai to complete the encirclement. The Viet Cong regiment on the peninsula would have nowhere to go. On the morning of August 18, 1965, Operation Starlite began. The amphibious force came in from the sea first, Marines in landing craft hitting beaches that the VC had not expected to be attacked from. The element of surprise was real. The Viet Cong had positioned themselves to attack north toward Chu Lai, not to defend against an assault coming in from their rear. Simultaneously, Marine helicopters lifted the inland blocking force into landing zones that cut off the escape routes from the peninsula. The plan worked, almost. What the planners had not fully anticipated was that the Viet Cong 1st Regiment was not going to simply run. They were experienced fighters who had been operating in Quang Ngai Province for years. They knew the terrain, they had prepared fighting positions, and when they found themselves being encircled, they turned and fought. The fighting on the Batangan Peninsula over the following days was intense, close, and costly. The Marines found themselves fighting through a landscape of hedgerows, tree lines, and fortified hamlets, where the Viet Cong had prepared defensive positions that channeled the attackers into kill zones. Every tree line had to be cleared. Every hedgerow concealed potential enemy positions. The open ground between cover was swept by Viet Cong machine guns. Marine casualties accumulated. At one position, a Marine platoon moving through a tree line came under intense fire from a Viet Cong force that had let the platoon partially enter the position before opening up on them from 3 sides. The Marines in the kill zone hit the ground and returned fire. Those behind them pushed forward to reach their pinned comrades. The fighting in the hedgerows and tree lines of the Batangan Peninsula looked nothing like the combined arms concept that had been planned in the Chu Lai Operations Center. It looked like men fighting other men at distances measured in meters, in terrain that reduced every technological advantage to irrelevance. In that kind of fighting, the outcome depended on individual Marines. Lance Corporal Joe Paul was one of them. Paul's squad was moving through vegetation when they came under fire. Paul saw that his squad leader was pinned and exposed to enemy fire. He moved toward the enemy position to draw fire away from his leader, taking hits himself, continuing to advance. He was wounded multiple times. He kept moving toward the enemy position until he could no longer continue. Joe Paul received the Medal of Honor for what he did in that hedgerow. He died of his wounds. He was 20 years old. His was not the only act of extraordinary courage in the 6 days of Operation Starlite. The fighting continued through August 19th, 20th, 21st. The encirclement held. The naval vessels offshore blocked escape by sea. The helicopter-inserted blocking forces held the landward routes. The Marines on the peninsula pushed through position after position, taking casualties and inflicting them. Naval gunfire from ships offshore provided fires that the Marine artillery could not. Ships can follow a moving battle in a way that ground artillery positions cannot. The naval gunfire coordinators with the Marine units called adjustments that brought shells to within very close distances of the fighting. Marine aviation worked the tree lines and enemy positions throughout the day, close air support strikes that went in just ahead of the advancing ground troops. The combined arms doctrine that the Marine Corps had developed, the integration of ground, air, and sea power into a single coherent operation, was being applied in combat for the first time in Vietnam. It worked. Imperfectly, expensively, with the kind of costs that nobody talks about when they discuss doctrine and planning. But it worked. By August 24th, Operation Starlite was complete. The accounting was conducted in the following days. 688 Viet Cong confirmed killed, captured weapons, destroyed equipment. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment, which had been planning to assault Chu Lai, had instead been caught on the Batangan Peninsula and systematically destroyed. 45 Marines had been killed. 203 wounded. The numbers were reported in Washington and in the press with satisfaction. American forces had met the Viet Cong in open battle and won decisively. The kill ratio was favorable. The operation had demonstrated that Marine combined arms tactics could defeat Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam. The lessons drawn from Operation Starlite shaped how American forces would conduct offensive operations for the remainder of the year. But there was another lesson in Starlite that took longer to recognize. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment had fought effectively even when encircled and outgunned. They had used the terrain to mitigate American firepower advantages. They had forced the fighting into conditions where individual skill and determination mattered more than helicopters and naval gunfire. And even in defeat, even with 688 dead, they had inflicted significant casualties on the attacking force. The men of the Viet Cong 1st Regiment, who survived the Batangan Peninsula, drew their own conclusions from the fighting. Not that American forces were unbeatable, that American forces could be hurt, that, in the right terrain, under the right conditions, at the right range, American technology became less decisive. These were the conclusions that would shape how the Viet Cong and NVA fought for the next 10 years. Operation Starlite is remembered as the first American offensive victory in Vietnam, and it was. But it was also the first demonstration of a pattern that would repeat itself throughout the war. Americans could find the enemy. Americans could fix the enemy. Americans could kill large numbers of the enemy with their combined arms superiority. And then the enemy would reconstitute. They would learn from what had worked and what had not. They would adapt. They would be ready for the next operation. The Batangan Peninsula would be the scene of American operations again and again. Each time, American forces would find Viet Cong or NVA forces operating in the area. Each time, the fighting would be difficult and costly. The terrain did not change. The determination of the forces fighting over it did not change. Only the names of the American units changed, as one rotation was replaced by the next. Operation Starlite, August 1965, the beginning of 10 years of American offensive operations in Vietnam. The first battle, the template for what followed. 45 Americans who paid the price for a concept that took a decade to reach its conclusion. And 688 Viet Cong, who died on a peninsula that the Marine Corps had sealed with a plan put together in 16 hours. This is where the American ground war in Vietnam began. This is Lost Patrol, the battles they never found. Thank you for watching. If you've been with us from Firebase Kate through the fall of Saigon, you've seen how the Vietnam War was fought, from the first offensive operations in 1965 to the last helicopter lifting off the embassy roof in 1975. Subscribe to Lost Patrol. We're not done yet. There are more battles, more stories, more men who deserve to be remembered. The battles they never found. We will find them. This is Lost Patrol. The Marines who fought on the Batangan Peninsula in August 1965 were among the first American ground combat troops to see serious action in Vietnam. Many of them had trained for years for exactly this kind of operation: amphibious assault, combined arms, the integration of ground and air and naval power. They had drilled for it. They had exercised for it. When it came, it was different from the exercises. The hedgerows were real. The fire from the tree lines was real. The men who went down in the open ground between cover were real. What the Marines of Operation Starlite discovered in those 6 days on the Batangan Peninsula was something that every generation of American soldiers in Vietnam would rediscover: that the gap between training and combat is bridged by individual human beings making decisions under stress that no training can fully replicate. Joe Paul knew what the training said. The training said find cover, suppress the enemy, maneuver to a flanking position. What Joe Paul did was move toward the enemy fire to draw it away from his pinned squad leader. The training did not tell him to do that. Something else did. Whatever it is in some men that produces that decision, the decision to move toward rather than away, produced it in Joe Paul on a hedgerow in Quang Ngai province in August 1965. He was 20 years old. He had been in Vietnam for a matter of weeks. He received the Medal of Honor. He did not live to know he had received it. This is also the story of Operation Starlite. Not just the doctrine, not just the combined arms concept, not just the kill ratios and the after-action reports. Joe Paul, 20 years old, moving toward the fire. This is the story of every battle on Lost Patrol. Not the plans, the men who executed them. Not the doctrine, the individuals who carried it. Not the history, the human beings who made it. Operation Starlite, August 18 to 24, 1965. The first battle, 45 Marines, and a 20-year-old Lance Corporal who moved toward the fire so someone else could live. The battles they never found. We found them. The Batangan Peninsula itself has a postscript that belongs in this story. American forces returned to the Batangan Peninsula repeatedly throughout the Vietnam War. Operation Piranha in September 1965. Operation Double Eagle in early 1966. Operation De Soto in 1967 and 1969. Operation Bold Mariner in 1969, the largest amphibious assault since Incheon. Every time, American forces found Viet Cong and NVA forces operating on or near the peninsula. Every time, there was fighting. Every time, there were casualties on both sides. The peninsula was never fully pacified. This is the other lesson of Operation Starlite that took years to understand. Tactical success, even decisive tactical success, does not automatically produce strategic results when the enemy can reconstitute and return. The Viet Cong 1st Regiment lost 688 soldiers on the Batangan Peninsula in August 1965. Within months, it had been rebuilt and was operating again. The Marines who came back for the subsequent operations found an enemy who had learned, positions that were better prepared, approaches that were better covered, tactics adapted to counter what the Marines had done before. This cycle, American operation, tactical success, enemy reconstitution, next American operation, defined much of the Vietnam War at the unit level. It defined what the war felt like to the men who fought it. You took a hill, you left the hill, you came back and took it again. You cleared a peninsula, the enemy came back to the peninsula, you cleared it again. The terrain did not change. Operation Starlite, the beginning. The fall of Saigon, the ending. 10 years, 58,000 Americans, a country that fought to the last helicopter. This is what Lost Patrol has covered, from the first battle to the last evacuation, from Firebase Kate to the embassy roof, from the jungles of Phuoc Tuy to the frozen mountains of North Korea. The battles they never found, we found them. Subscribe to Lost Patrol, there are more.